Before we continue, if you enjoy realistic, dark and mysterious stories, subscribe to the channel. Here, each story reveals secrets that should never have come to light. And feel free to comment, where are you watching from right now? Your presence here is part of this narrative. The announcement of the purchase barely attracted attention outside financial circles. A billionaire real estate mogul had acquired an old property in a forgotten region of the American countryside, far from urban centers and tourist maps. To the local newspapers, it was just another multi-million-dollar transaction. To the residents of the small nearby town, it was the resurgence of something that should never have been remembered. The mansion rested atop a hill covered in twisted trees, their roots piercing the earth like fingers reaching for the surface. The access road, partially swallowed by undergrowth, had been unused for decades. Fallen fences, rusty signs, and a constant silence surrounded the place. A silence that seemed not natural, but imposed, as if time had been forcibly contained there. The new owner, known for transforming ruins into symbols of luxury, saw no mystery where others saw fear. For him, that mansion was just another undervalued asset. A challenge. A project capable of reinforcing his reputation as a man who bought what no one else dared to touch. On the first day, he arrived accompanied only by a driver and 2 security guards. The main gate gave way with a long metallic creak echoing through the valley. No birds took flight, no insects stirred. The sound seemed to die before reaching the more distant trees. The mansion's facade still retained an unsettling grandeur. Tall windows, many of them broken, watched the arrival like empty eyes. The main door was locked, but the rotten wood couldn't withstand a single impact. The interior revealed a dense air, heavy with old dust and something harder to define, a metallic, almost imperceptible odor that made the throat burn. While the security guards examined the ground floor rooms, the billionaire walked unhurriedly, touching walls, analyzing structures, calculating costs. Torn carpets hid dark stains on the floor. Crooked paintings still hung on the walls, depicting unidentified faces, all with expressions too rigid to be natural. None of that bothered him. The first sign of resistance came from the local administrator hired to handle the paperwork. A middle-aged man, born and raised in that region, avoided looking directly at the hill as he spoke. He warned about incomplete records, old files never finished, unexplained fires in the county archives. He mentioned, almost apologetically, that no one had stayed in that mansion for more than a few months since the beginning of the last century. The billionaire ended the conversation quickly. Fear didn't fit into spreadsheets. In the following days, the restoration team began their work. The upper floor revealed serious leaks, unstable ceilings, and corridors that seemed longer inside than their external measurements indicated. Tools disappeared. Closed doors were found open again. One of the workers swore he heard footsteps above him, even though he was alone on the top floor. The complaints were ignored until the focus shifted to the basement. The entrance was behind a narrow door in the kitchen, almost invisible beneath layers of peeling paint. The staircase spiraled down, swallowed by darkness. Access was sealed by a makeshift structure of concrete and iron, clearly added after the original construction. There was no mention of the basement in the archived plans. When the team suggested leaving that area isolated, the billionaire insisted on being present at the opening. The first knocks echoed unevenly, as if the sound were absorbed before returning. As the concrete gave way, the air escaping from within was too cold for the region's climate. An old smell spread quickly, causing one of the workers to recoil in nausea. The flashlight revealed damp stone walls, deep marks like scratches, and symbols scratched haphazardly. They didn't look decorative. They looked like warnings. Deep in the basement, something was covered by thick tarpaulins, held together with rusty chains. No one approached immediately. The silence down there was different, heavy, oppressive, as if every breath were a mistake. The billionaire was the first to step forward. As the chains began to be removed, one of the security guards asked them to stop. His voice faltered mid-sentence. The request was ignored, the tarp was pulled down, and at that moment, something changed. There were no screams. There was no immediate collapse, just the clear and absolute feeling that the basement was never sealed to keep something out, but to keep something contained. And now, the mansion was no longer empty. The impact of opening the basement wasn't immediately apparent. There were no accidents that night, nor any inexplicable sounds that could easily be pointed to as evidence of something wrong. What emerged was more subtle, an almost imperceptible change in the behavior of the people who remained in the mansion. The billionaire, accustomed to controlling environments and people, began to sleep very little. He didn't report nightmares, but he always woke up at the same time, shortly before dawn, with the feeling that something had been interrupted. He began to wander around the still dark house, observing details he had previously ignored. Doors that creaked only when he passed by, drafts in closed corridors, shadows that seemed to move slowly across the walls. The restoration team dwindled. 2 workers quit on the same day, citing personal reasons. A third simply didn't return after lunch. Security cameras only showed him leaving through the main gate, but his vehicle was never found. The nearest town reacted to the commotion with quiet unease. The small market, the gas station, and the roadside bar became observation points. Whenever someone mentioned the mansion, conversation ceased. The older folks changed the subject. The younger ones feigned disinterest, but avoided the hill at dusk. Among them was Ruth Calder, a local librarian responsible for preserving old records that had escaped the county fires. Upon learning of the mansion's reopening, she began reviewing forgotten newspapers, incomplete minutes, and unofficial accounts. The property's name appeared repeatedly associated with vague words: accident, ban, emergency, withdrawal. There were never any complete explanations. Ruth noticed a disturbing pattern. Whenever something serious was recorded, the text was interrupted or replaced with irrelevant announcements in subsequent editions, as if someone had deliberately erased the conclusions. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, the spaces began to influence the decisions of those who remained there. The basement, officially isolated after the initial discovery, had become a silent point of attraction. The billionaire didn't go down, but frequently stopped before the sealed door, as if waiting for something. The security guards, once vigilant, began to avoid that corridor, unconsciously reorganizing their routes. One of them, Marcus, a veteran private security guard, began recording small incidents: lights that malfunctioned only in the basement, sensors triggered without detectable movement, abrupt temperature drops during the early morning hours. No single report seemed alarming in isolation. Together, they formed an unsettling pattern. The symbols seen on the basement walls began to appear in other parts of the house. Not painted, not engraved, they emerged as superficial marks on wood, stone, even dusty glass. Always imperfect, always incomplete, like unsuccessful attempts at reproduction. The billionaire noticed, but didn't comment. His antagonist didn't present himself as a clear figure, but as the very structure of the mansion, and the past it imposed. Unlike visible threats, there was no direct confrontation. There was influence, pressure, a constant, invisible push that altered decisions, delayed actions, and isolated people. Ruth decided to visit the hill. Her arrival coincided with late afternoon, when the sun no longer fully illuminated the facade. She wasn't met with hostility, only with bewilderment. Upon entering, she felt the heavy air that wasn't mentioned in any historical document, but which confirmed her suspicions. As he walked through the corridors, he recognized architectural patterns that were rare for the region: improvised adaptations, reinforced walls with no clear structural function, corridors that ended abruptly. Everything indicated modifications made not to expand, but to contain. When she mentioned the basement, the silence that followed was more revealing than any answer. The billionaire looked away for the first time since they met. That night, Ruth returned to the library and found something not listed in the public records, an incomplete diary kept among anonymous donations. The final pages were torn out. The remaining pages described an attempt at isolation, not from something external, but from something that reacted to human presence. Meanwhile, at the mansion, a door that had never been opened since the restoration unlocked itself. The world around the story was beginning to shrink, and the one who had been sleeping in the basement seemed finally to realize that he was no longer alone. Marcus's disappearance wasn't immediate, nor dramatic enough to cause panic. He simply stopped responding. His radio remained charged, his lodging untouched, and his vehicle still parked beside the mansion. To the billionaire, it was treated as desertion. For Ruth, who had returned to the hill that morning, it was the first clear sign that the situation had gone beyond the bounds of rationality. The work routine was maintained by force. New security guards were hired, replacing those who refused to continue. None of them stayed for more than a week. They all exhibited the same behavior before leaving: excessive silence, irritability, and the strange tendency to avoid certain corridors, even without prior instruction. The basement, although officially sealed, began to interfere with the functioning of the house. The electrical system presented faults concentrated in that area. Generators would shut down on their own. Alarms would go off at precise times, always shortly before dawn. No fault could be reproduced during technical inspections. The billionaire, pressured by delays and mounting losses, decided to act. He ordered a complete inspection of the basement, going against technical recommendations and ignoring Ruth's warnings, who insisted that the mansion be sealed again. He couldn't accept the idea of losing control of his own investment. The descent occurred in the early evening. The team was minimal: 2 engineers, a newly hired security guard, and the owner himself. The spiral staircase seemed deeper than before. The flashlights revealed new marks on the walls, recent grooves, as if something had been slowly dragged against the stone. The air was colder, the silence more absolute. Deep in the basement, the area previously covered by tarps was now completely exposed. The chains had been removed days before, but no one remembered doing so. In the center of the space, there was a darkened wooden structure resembling an improvised altar, surrounded by circular markings on the floor. The security guard retreated first. Before anyone could react, the ladder behind them emitted a dry crack. The lighting flickered for a few seconds. When it returned, the younger engineer was no longer there. There was no sound of a struggle, just absence. Panic set in, restrained, almost disciplined. The billionaire ordered an immediate retreat. They ran upstairs, stumbling over steps that seemed to shift position. The basement door slammed shut the moment the last one reached the hallway. The following morning, the disappearance was reported as a workplace accident. No authorities entered the mansion. Documents were signed. Compensation was paid. The conflict didn't explode publicly. It deepened. Ruth, in turn, advanced the investigations. She connected the incomplete diary to reports from regional newspapers from the early 20th century. She discovered that the mansion had been briefly used as an informal confinement space during a local health crisis. People considered unrecoverable were isolated there. The records always ended the same way: transfer suspended, property seized, files destroyed. Nothing indicated that anyone had left. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere became hostile. Doors would lock for no reason. Rooms seemed to move around. Staff reported muffled voices coming from the walls, not words, but rhythmic sounds like regular knocking, always in groups of 3. The billionaire began acting erratically. He spent hours observing old building plans, scribbling notes he didn't remember making. He defended contradictory decisions in meetings. He would cancel the restoration and then resume it on the same day. His antagonist, invisible, didn't need to confront him directly. All it had to do was apply pressure. The conflict took on a new dimension when Ruth confronted the owner with her findings. She presented evidence that the basement was not a structural addition, but the original core of the building. The rest of the mansion had been built around it, like an envelope. The revelation didn't bring immediate fear. It brought denial. That night, something finally became unequivocally clear. The cameras recorded movement in the basement, even though no one went down. The images showed shadows accumulating in the corners, slowly converging towards the center. The temperature plummeted throughout the house. Windows cracked without impact, and for the first time, a voice was heard. It wasn't coming from the walls. It came from inside the wooden structure in the basement. The conflict, previously psychological and environmental, was becoming active, and there was no longer any way to pretend that the mansion was just an old building. The incident, captured by the cameras, altered the fragile balance that still held the mansion together. There was no attempt at external disclosure, but the information spread silently internally. Employees began to act as if they were being watched all the time, even in newly restored areas. Small decisions, choosing a corridor, remaining in a room, turning off a light, began to carry excessive weight. A subplot emerged from the security logs. A technician tasked with reviewing the digital files noticed that old recordings were being overwritten without human intervention. There was no technical pattern. The deleted sections always coincided with times of peak activity in the basement. It was as if something was choosing what shouldn't be seen. At the same time, Ruth deepened her own investigation. She located descendants of former residents of the region who for generations had avoided any mention of the mansion. One of these families preserved an oral account passed down as a warning, not as history. It spoke of a place created to contain excess, a space where what could not be integrated into society was confined until it lost its form. These accounts revealed that the basement served not only to imprison people, but to subject them to a process of gradual annihilation. There were no recorded executions, there was waiting, long enough for identities to dissolve. Meanwhile, the billionaire was facing a parallel crisis. Investors began to pressure him over constant delays and rising costs. A long-time partner demanded full access to the property for an audit. The visit was scheduled against the owner's wishes, creating an implicit countdown. This external pressure forced internal decisions. To avoid exposure, the billionaire authorized the partial reopening of the mansion to a restricted public, under the pretext of a technical visit. The measure was not aimed at immediate profit, but at diluting responsibility. More people meant more witnesses, and less focus on him. The mansion reacted. During preparations for the visit, areas considered safe began to malfunction. The service elevator stopped between floors. The ventilation system started expelling excessively cold air only in certain rooms. The symbolic markings, previously discreet, became more frequent, appearing in mandatory passageways. Another subplot developed around one of the new security guards hired after the disappearances. Unlike the previous ones, he didn't avoid the basement. On the contrary, he would remain for long periods near the sealed door, as if he could hear something. Reports indicated that he was responding to commands that no one had issued. Ruth cross-referenced information and discovered that this security guard had a family history linked to the property's former management. His grandfather appeared in fragmented records as responsible for internal maintenance during the period of closure. It wasn't a coincidence. It was continuity. The billionaire's internal conflict intensified. He began to defend the security guard's continued presence, even in the face of clearly anomalous behavior. In meetings, he reacted with hostility to any mention of his removal. His stance indicated not only stubbornness, but an unconscious alignment with the wishes of the household. The subplots began to converge when Ruth realized something crucial. All the people who had disappeared or been most intensely affected had spent enough time in the basement, even if briefly. The mansion didn't attack randomly. It selected. On the eve of the investor's visit, the security technician found a file that shouldn't have been there. A recent recording showed the basement active, illuminated by a light source that wasn't registered in the system. In the center of the image, the wooden structure appeared expanded, as if it had been reinforced from the inside. Hours later, the coach disappeared. The subplots, previously parallel, are no longer secondary. They now formed a single, silent question. The mansion was preparing for something, and it needed people for it. The morning of the visit began without any visible incidents, which made everything more unsettling. The sky was clear, the temperature mild, and the mansion appeared artificially normal, almost rehearsed. The billionaire received the investors with excessive security, leading them only through previously restored areas. None of them mentioned the basement. None of them needed to. The mansion dictated the script. The first mishap occurred when the newly installed panoramic elevator stopped between the second and third floors. The doors did not open completely, revealing only a corridor that was not included in the original plans. Before anyone could intervene, two of the visitors walked through the narrow opening, convinced that it was a technical access point. They did not return. The billionaire tried to maintain control, claiming a temporary structural failure. But the prolonged silence and lack of communication began to break down the facade. Systems failed in sequence. Containment doors closed. The mansion began to operate like an isolated organism, restricting movement and separating people in a calculated way. Ruth, who was accompanying the visit against the owner's wishes, immediately recognized the pattern. This wasn't a defensive reaction. It was final preparation. She ran to the closed-off wing and forced her way into the basement. The door, once sturdy, gave way with alarming ease. The staircase seemed wider, deeper. Each step amplified the sound of her footsteps like a belated warning. In the center of the basement, the wooden structure was no longer the same. It had been expanded, reinforced by internal layers visible through cracks. It didn't look built, it looked cultivated. And then came the revelation. Ruth recognized the complete symbols for the first time. They were not marks of containment, but of repetition. The mansion did not imprison what was inside. It reproduced it. The basement had been created as a nucleus of absorption. Each isolated person, each identity dissolved over the decades, fed something that didn't need a fixed form. It expanded by assimilating behaviors, fragmented memories, human reactions. The mansion was merely the outer shell of a continuous process. The turning point came when the billionaire came down alone, without warning anyone, without an escort. He wasn't lured away. He decided. Upon reaching the bottom, it became clear that he understood more than he had admitted. In his pockets were ancient blueprints, notes that corresponded exactly to the complete symbols on the ground. He hadn't discovered the secret recently. He had recognized it. The billionaire hadn't bought the mansion by chance. His revelation was quiet but devastating. He had been tracking properties associated with similar projects, places where social failures had been isolated rather than resolved. That basement was one of the few still active. He didn't intend to destroy it. He intended to control it. The antagonist, previously vague, gained definition. It wasn't just the mansion. It was the convergence between the old structure and modern ambition. The danger lay not only in what was contained, but in who wished to use it. The ground trembled slightly. The walls emitted the familiar rhythmic sound. 3 knocks, pause. 3 knocks. The structure responded to the billionaire's presence differently. There was no hostility. There was recognition. Ruth tried to intervene, but was restrained by the security guard connected to the previous administration. He didn't seem aware of his surroundings. His movements were too precise, synchronized with the rhythm of the basement. At the final turning point, the structure opened up, not as a door, but as an answer. The billionaire took a step forward, and the mansion, for the first time in over a century, ceased to merely contain. She chose. The opening of the structure did not produce an immediate visible impact. There was no explosion, nor physical collapse of the mansion. What occurred was deeper and more difficult to contain. The entire environment seemed to readjust, as if it had reached a long-awaited stage. The billionaire did not return from the basement. The cameras remained active, but no images showed him leaving. The systems recorded his presence for hours, then for minutes, until all indicators simply ceased. There was no sign of a struggle, nor physical evidence of his disappearance. He was absorbed into the normal functioning of the house, as if he had never been an outsider. Ruth felt the effect almost immediately. The mansion became more stable, a disturbing paradox. Doors stopped swinging on their own. The extreme cold disappeared. Electrical malfunctions ceased. It was as if the house had found a new equilibrium at the cost of a single, highly significant human presence. The surviving investors managed to leave with difficulty, disoriented and unable to clearly recount what they had seen. Their accounts differed in details, but converged on one point: the feeling that the mansion was complete, satisfied. The security guard, linked to the previous administration, was found motionless near the basement stairs. He was alive, but unresponsive to external stimuli. Subsequent examinations indicated an absence of complex cognitive activity. He was breathing, nothing more. The consequences spread beyond the physical boundaries of the property. Digital documents related to the purchase disappeared from financial systems. Legal records were automatically archived as closed. The property was listed as having no active owner, a legal void impossible to explain. Ruth tried to act quickly. She contacted state authorities, presented reports, historical records, and recordings. The responses were evasive. Some messages went unanswered. Others returned with requests to drop the matter. The institutional resistance was nothing new, just more efficient. Inside the mansion, the reaction wasn't one of aggression, but of reorganization. Previously unstable spaces became functional. The basement, now sealed again without human intervention, seemed less oppressive. Not because it was empty, but because it contained exactly what was needed. Ruth realized what had happened too late. The mansion didn't react to ordinary people. It reacted to individuals capable of expanding its reach. The billionaire, with his resources, influence, and intention to control, represented a threat of exposure and expansion. By assimilating him, the system stabilized and protected itself. This understanding brought a new layer of horror. The antagonist was not evil in the traditional sense. It was adaptive and efficient. The emotional reaction of those involved was restrained, almost numb. No one cried publicly, no one demanded answers. Silence prevailed as a collective response, reinforced by fear, convenience, and a strange sense of relief. Ruth returned to the library certain that her records would never be published. Even so, she continued to write. Not to alert the authorities, but to preserve memory. The diary she began to compile did not seek complete explanations. It saw patterns. On the last night before leaving the city, she passed by the hill one last time. The lights in the mansion were off, no sign of activity. Still, the feeling of a presence lingered. The consequences were not explosive. They were silent, and that made everything much more dangerous. Ruth didn't leave town immediately. The decision to stay was less an act of courage and more a practical necessity. Someone needed to understand what remained after the mansion had become established. The billionaire's absence had closed a cycle, but hadn't destroyed the mechanism. The system continued to function, just less exposed. The first challenge arose when state authorities finally sent representatives. Unlike previous visits, they didn't arrive out of curiosity. but with clear instructions to shut down any remaining investigations. Ruth realized that the obstacle now wasn't the mansion, but the human structure that protected it for historical convenience. She adjusted her approach. Instead of confronting, he began to observe. He catalogued visit patterns, schedules, and automatically filed documents. He discovered that the mansion functioned as a bureaucratic convergence point. Whenever something threatened to draw excessive attention, processes were cancelled, reports were lost, and schedules were altered. Not through direct manipulation, but through the overlapping of small, induced human decisions. Ruth grew up understanding this. Her transformation wasn't heroic or grandiose, it was strategic. She began operating outside the direct circle of the mansion. She created physical copies of documents, scattered records among university libraries, private archives, and personal collections. She wasn't seeking to reveal the secret. She was seeking to make it impossible to erase completely. Meanwhile, the mansion itself presented new challenges. People who approached without a clear intention were repelled by trivial factors. Cars broke down, storms arose locally, access roads were blocked. But those with specific motivations, academic curiosity, economic exploration, control, felt a growing attraction. Ruth realized that the house didn't test character, it tested usefulness. Her growth solidified when she accepted that she couldn't defeat the mansion, she could only limit its impact. This shift in perspective freed her from the need for direct confrontation, allowing for more effective actions. A new character emerged in this process, an independent historian who had received one of the documents scattered around Ruth. He wasn't seeking fame or institutional validation. He was seeking connections. Together, they established an informal monitoring system, not of the mansion itself, but of the people who were beginning to move toward it. The final challenge in this arc occurred when a smaller company attempted to acquire the property, lured by the legal vacuum left by the billionaire. Ruth discreetly intervened, providing incomplete information, just enough to raise doubts without revealing the true danger. The negotiation collapsed due to administrative inconsistencies. Ruth's overcoming wasn't emotional, but functional. She stopped reacting to the horror and began operating within it. The mansion, in turn, responded with calculated indifference. It didn't try to silence her. It didn't try to lure her in. Ruth wasn't useful to the process. And that paradoxically kept her safe. Her most visible change was internal. The initial fear gave way to constant, controlled vigilance. She no longer sought definitive closures. She sought delays. Each year without new disappearances was a silent victory. At the end of that period, Ruth decided to leave the city, not as an escape, but as an expansion of her reach. She carried with her only copies and notes, nothing that could be easily traced. As he left, he looked one last time at the hill. The mansion remained motionless, integrated into the landscape as if it had always belonged there. Ruth had grown up enough to understand the real challenge. Some structures don't need to be destroyed to lose power. Simply prevent them from finding anyone to feed them. The period of stability didn't last as long as Ruth had hoped. The absence of major events didn't mean inactivity, just reorganization. From a distance, she continued to monitor indirect signs, atypical real estate transactions, requests for access to old files, recurring inquiries about properties without a defined owner. That's how he noticed the first real warning sign. An international consortium specializing in venture capital acquisitions began mapping the region. Unlike previous attempts, they weren't just looking for the mansion, but for the pattern of similar properties scattered throughout the country. The mansion had ceased to be an isolated point. It had become a model. Ruth returned to the city discreetly. The atmosphere was different, quieter, more organized. The hill showed no visible signs of activity, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. It wasn't a threat, it was anticipation. The partner historian confirmed the worst-case scenario. The consortium had gained access to fragments of records describing the basement as a functional core. They didn't know exactly what that meant, but they understood its strategic value. The risk now was not reactivation, it was replication. The build-up to the climax didn't involve barricades or direct confrontations. It involved time. Ruth knew that any rash action would attract the attention of the manor and the consortium. Instead, she created deliberate delays. She fed conflicting versions of the records. She introduced subtle errors into old translations. She spread inconsistent dates, all too small to seem like sabotage, big enough to prevent quick decisions. The mansion reacted minimally. No hostile events, no attempt at assimilation. This worried Ruth more than any previous manifestation. The house seemed confident that the process would reach her anyway. Another element heightened the tension. The consortium announced a joint technical visit involving private representatives and government observers. It wasn't an immediate purchase. It was a validation. The date has been set. The mansion, for the first time since the Billionaire's acquisition, displayed a clear sign. Lights turned on by themselves during the early morning hours. Not all of them, though, only those in the basement. Ruth understood that she wouldn't initiate the climax. The final preparation involved a difficult decision. She gathered all the remaining records, physical copies, notes, comparative maps, and chose what to destroy. Not to hide the truth, but to prevent its practical use. She kept only enough to prove patterns, not mechanisms. The historian disagreed, but accepted. They both knew that applicable knowledge was the true fuel of the mansion. On the eve of the visit, Ruth entered the property for the last time, not to confront but to observe. The interior was too clean, too organized. The mansion didn't seem abandoned. It seemed ready. In the basement, the structure remained sealed, but the atmosphere pulsed with a contained presence. There were no sounds, there were no new symbols. Everything was on hold. Ruth left the mansion before dawn. She took nothing with her, not even notes, only memories. The preparation for the climax was complete. What came next would no longer depend on her, and that was the most terrifying aspect of all. The consortium arrived under a heavy sky, although no rain was forecast. Discreet vehicles advanced along the restored road, breaking the isolation the hill had maintained for decades. Unlike previous visits, there was no explicit curiosity or visible discomfort. The visitors moved with a clear purpose, equipped with devices, scanners, compact drones, and sealed folders. The mansion couldn't withstand the intrusion. The gate opened silently. The interior doors unlocked in sequence. The power systems functioned perfectly. The house offered complete access, as if it recognized a shared purpose within that group. Ruth watched from a distance, from a high point on the road. She didn't intervene. The climax wasn't about preventing, it was about revealing. Inside, the technical visit proceeded with surgical efficiency. Each group was led through different corridors, not by mistake, but by the mansion's own choice. The separation was calculated. There was no panic, just absolute concentration. The moment the first scanner was activated underground, the basement responded, not through violence, but through expansion. The sealed structure began to emit almost imperceptible vibrations, adjusting the surrounding environment. Walls reinforced internally, the air became denser, sensors recorded impossible readings, thermal overlap, redundant acoustic patterns, spatial variations incompatible with the known measurements. The visitors did not back down. That's when the turning point occurred. One of the government representatives recognized the complete symbols on the basement floor. He hadn't studied them out of academic curiosity, but because of prior involvement. Confidential documents, kept out of circulation, had already described similar structures as experimental social containment systems, officially abandoned but never deactivated. The mansion was not a historical accident. It was a functional remnant. The moment this understanding solidified, the structure reacted decisively. This time, it didn't choose an individual. It chose a group. The exits began to disappear, not physically, but functionally. Corridors led to the same point. Stairs ended where they began. External communication failed without any detectable technical fault. Ruth felt the impact from a distance. She didn't hear any sounds, but she perceived the change in the rhythm of the hill, as if the place were breathing more slowly. Inside the mansion, the climax reached its peak when the structure opened again, larger, more defined. It didn't absorb everyone. It selected those with a clear intention of replication and control. The rest were pushed out by a sequence of mundane events, localized fire alarms, unlocked doors, opportune mechanical failures. The chosen ones did not disappear immediately. They were integrated. The devices continued reading for a few minutes before ceasing. Data was recorded but rendered unusable. Files became corrupted in repetitive patterns, like echoes of information without a known origin. The government representative tried to resist, not physically, but conceptually. He argued, he negotiated, he offered future restraint. The structure did not respond. It didn't need to. In the final moment of the climax, something changed in the behavior of the mansion. She stopped the process on her own initiative. The vibrations ceased. The atmosphere stabilized. The exits reappeared. The survivors were released, confused, unable to explain the partial loss of the group. Ruth understood the protagonist's visible transformation at the climax. She ceased to be merely an observer and became an indirect guardian, not by heroic choice, but by functional exclusion. The mansion didn't need her inside, it needed her outside, keeping the world sufficiently disorganized to prevent effective replication. The climax did not end in destruction. It ended with a silent agreement, unilaterally imposed. The mansion remained active, but now there were clear limits. The days following the incident were not marked by public investigations or alarming headlines. The official narrative was fragmented, contradictory, and quickly diluted by other events that were easier to explain. Some members of the consortium left the country. Others resumed different positions in areas with no apparent connection to what happened. Nothing has been officially closed. The mansion returned to operational silence. No light came on without reason. No system failed. The property remained listed as legally undefined, a technicality that deterred serious buyers and attracted only occasional curious onlookers, all repelled by trivial obstacles before even reaching the hill. Ruth assumed her new position with uncomfortable clarity. She was neither the keeper of absolute secrets nor an invisible heroine. She was a point of equilibrium. She continued distributing harmless fragments of information, enough to confuse, insufficient to empower. Her work became preventive, almost bureaucratic. The ultimate consequences of the character's actions were revealed slowly. The consortium halted similar projects, not out of outright fear, but due to practical infeasibility. The government representative involved requested indefinite medical leave. His subsequent reports contained inexplicable gaps. The historian remained active, but never published anything directly related to the mansion. His studies came to focus on historical patterns of institutional isolation, always without concrete examples. The absence of names made the work acceptable and dangerous enough to survive. In the long run, the mansion ceased to be a specific location and became an implicit concept, a reminder that certain solutions created to contain human problems do not disappear. They adapt, they wait. Ruth grew old with this awareness. She moved cities several times, always on the lookout for similar signs elsewhere. She never found another active group, perhaps because they were rare, perhaps because they learned too quickly. In his last written statement, he made only a simple observation. Structures created to solve what society doesn't want to confront never cease to function. They simply change scale. The conclusion offered no comfort. It offered coherence. And that was more disturbing than any tragic ending. Years later, a discreet update appeared in a state database. The Hill property was now listed as structural preservation zone, without a designated legal representative. No announcement accompanied the move. Satellite images showed the mansion intact, unchanged throughout the seasons. No renovations, no deterioration. In a distant library, a physical file received a new handwritten note, unsigned, stable nucleus, no expansion detected. The world moved on. The mansion remained. Stories like this one speak not only of forgotten places, but of human decisions that people choose to hide rather than confront. If this narrative has stirred unease, reflection, or discomfort in you, share your interpretation. What struck you most? The mansion, the people who tried to control it, or the silence that formed around it? Share your opinion. Share this story with those who enjoy realistic mysteries and reflect. How many similar structures might exist, invisible, operating silently around us? Your reading is part of the cycle that keeps these stories alive.